Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. No matter where you are located in the world, the UCLA Center for Middle East Development would like to welcome you back for our second edition of CMED Chats. My name is Salome Mahajer. I am CMED's project manager and so very excited to have you here with us today. As you may know, CMED Chats project will engage charismatic guests who are from the Middle East and North Africa or who are connected to the region in some capacity. We plan to bring you anyone from diplomats, activists, journalists, and policymakers to artists, musicians, filmmakers, and many more guests who can help us dig deeper into an often misunderstood, complex part of the world. Our hosts and guests will sit down for one-on-one casual chats for at least 30 minutes. They will cover a variety of topics and highlight the many diverse voices and realities that enrich the colorful region we lovingly know as MENA. All CMED Chats episodes will be recorded live and can be viewed on CMED's website or YouTube page within 24 hours of this broadcast. We will not be accepting audience questions for our live guests. However, if you have any logistics questions, feel free to let us know in the Q&A window located at the bottom of your screen. We will do our best to address all of your queries. And without further ado, I will pass the microphone to CMED's fearless leader, Professor Steven Spiegel, a man who has dedicated his entire life to the betterment of the region and who is highly regarded in the world of Middle East thinkers, peace creators, and policymakers. Steve, take it away.
Thank you, Salome. Well, I want to say hello to everyone from around the world, literally. Today, we really have a very special treat for all of us. I'll be sitting down with the well-known, famous, and highly regarded Robin Wright, who is, of course, a longtime CMED friend, international renowned international journalist, and we'll be discussing her remarkable experiences from the field and perspectives on recent Middle East affairs. I have to ask, because of something I see, are we all set? And can everybody see everything they need to see? Salome?
Yes, we can see everything, Steve.
Great. So, Robin Wright is a senior fellow at the U.S. Institute of Peace and the Woodrow Wilson Center. She has reported from more than 140 countries for the New Yorker, the Washington Post, Time, the New York Times Magazine, and the Los Angeles Times, among others. She has also been a fellow with the Brookings Institution, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Yale, Duke, Stanford, Dartmouth, and my notes say the University of California. I assume that's Berkeley. She has received numerous awards for her work, including the UN Correspondents Association Gold Medal for International Affairs, the National Magazine Award for Iran Reportage, and the Overseas Press Club Award for her coverage of African wars. She has also authored 8 books, and many of you know her from seeing her on television, news reports, and the like. So my first question, which was reinforced by a short discussion we had a few minutes ago, is how did Robin Wright become Robin Wright? I have some thoughts about this myself, but I'd like to hear from her. So how did you become a world famous and fantastic reporter, writer, speaker, and beloved by so many?
It's a big question, but first let me say what an honor it is to be with you, Steve. So many around the world so deeply appreciate all you've done to foster understanding and dialogue among diverse people and even rival parties. You are an epic contributor to peace across the region and the kinds of things that I, as a journalist, have always believed in. So I'm honored to be with you. When it comes to your question, life is a set of kind of coincidences. As I am the daughter of a law professor and sports fanatic who desperately wanted a son, but got stuck with girls. And I, as the oldest child, was the one who was schlepped to every sports event at the University of Michigan. And so when I ended up at Michigan in college, I decided to play a prank on my father, and that I would go to the student paper and I would write one piece on sports to surprise him. And the irony is that one piece led to a love of journalism, and I became the first female sports editor of a student paper in this country. And I didn't really intend to become a journalist. I'm a history major, but I got summer jobs, internships on papers, and one thing turned to another. And I ended up in the Middle East because one of my early assignments was to go to Iran in 1973. And en route there, I had to stop in Beirut, and I landed on October 6, 1973, which you, Steve, will recognize. When I got off the plane, a woman next to me said, "The Egyptians have just crossed the Suez Canal," and the war had started. So I've been sucked into the Middle East now for almost 50 years.
Wow. All right. So let's go on with this. You've analyzed or been in 140 countries on 7 continents. And of course, your articles for the New Yorker are famous and followed so closely. Of all the crises you've experienced, which have been the most difficult to handle and which the easiest?
So I'll surprise you with my answer. A year and a half ago, I went to Antarctica.
Great.
and it was my 7th continent. And it was in many ways the most profound experience of my life, because I began to fully grasp the scope of Earth's challenges. And, you know, the war between the human species and Mother Nature is arguably the one that is the most important of my lifetime, and the one that is enduring and that will affect humanity the most of all. In terms of the kind of conflicts I've covered, you know, there have been many hair-raising moments. When I go to cover a war, I don't embed with American troops. I go to live on the ground with those who are experiencing war. And for example, I lived in Beirut for 5 years during the Civil War, the rise of Hezbollah, the Israeli invasion, when the very first suicide bombs went off at the American embassy and at the Marine compound, which caused the largest loss of US military life in a single incident since Iwo Jima during World War II. So they're, you know, hair-raising, horrifying on multiple levels. I covered wars in Africa that were some of the most life-threatening to me. During the Angolan Civil War, I went in with a militia group backed by the US that had used British mercenaries. We were in a town of 350 people, and the Cuban troops were supporting the Marxist government, and they moved into the town. And the only way out was to get one little boat that was on the Congo River to cross into what was then Zaire, now the Congo. And out of 350 people, only 22 of us made it out alive. So that, in many ways, was the most hair-raising. I think one of the most moving was the anti-apartheid movement being in South Africa on June 16th, 1976, which was the day of the first Black mass uprising. So the conflicts play out in different ways, affect humanity in different ways, have impacts that are very diverse. So I don't have a favorite war. I did Stephen Colbert twice, and for 2 of my books, and he said, "You've covered 12 wars, which is your favorite?" And, you know, I said, "I guess Beirut, because there were so many wars."
So let's turn to the present. although we can get back to many stories. And we're in a changing America. We've had two very distinct presidents in the last 5 years. And do you think there's a lot of conflict on this, but do you think that the region's view of the United States has changed? And if so, how?
I think it's changed in a lot of ways.
Of course, the region has so many different people.
It does.
Go
And
ahead.
I think there's one bottom line, and that is American credibility has eroded in the 21st century under President Bush, somewhat under Obama too, because that coincided with the Arab Spring and the various roles or lack of roles the US played, particularly under President Trump. Joe Biden has a very difficult task in proving America's interest. And frankly, the fact that we are withdrawing not just from Afghanistan, but resources from across the region, there is concern about American interest, American commitment, what America's role is going to be in the future in terms of standing up to whether it's extremism or authoritarianism. We've kind of ceded to the Russians when it comes to Syria. Iranian influence is arguably greater than at any time since 2003 when the US invaded Iraq. So I think there's a lot of questioning about American credibility, and it's going to take more than one president or his actions to prove that America is interested. And frankly, I think Steve, as you and I know, because we've lived through so many of these conflicts, that I think America doesn't care as much about the Middle East. The Arab-Israeli conflict, which once defined what the US did, what broader Western interests and international interests were, has just almost disappeared off the map. And so I'm concerned about what America does, what role it'll play, just as much as I think many in the region are.
I want to actually pick up exactly from what you just said and ask you about Iran. If there's one issue now that makes it more and more difficult for the United States to totally withdraw, it seems to me at least, it's Iran. And Iran has become so important for all sorts of reasons. What do you did work in Iran, as you just said, and you know it. Iran just has almost, I was going to say appointed accidentally, but I don't know that was much of an election, but there's a new president who's very close to the supreme leader. And does Iran keep the United States in the Middle East, or does it cause us to rush away?
Great question, and arguably the most important question when it comes to the US role in the Middle East. The United States can pivot to China or to broader Asia by lessening its intervention, its military presence, its aid to whether it's Iraq, to the Gulf states, potentially even Israel, Egypt, elsewhere, but it cannot leave the Middle East until it deals with the Iranian question. And it's not just one of its nuclear program anymore. It's much wider than that. One of the striking things that's happened in the last 5 years since the Iran nuclear deal is Iran's improvement, its escalation, its advancements in its missile program, its drones. It now has other far more tangible instruments of war to threaten the Middle East or to present a challenge. While I think that the odds are in favor of returning to the nuclear agreement that's now being brokered in Vienna by the world's 6 major powers, I am very skeptical that there will be any kind of improvement, any progress on the other 3 big questions that loom large: the missile program, Iran's meddling in the region or its influence in the region, and its abysmal human rights record. And I think those are going to be much harder to find compromise. They will involve a much wider array of players, including on the missile question, Saudi Arabia and Israel, when it comes to meddling in the region. That deals with wars in Yemen, conflict in Iraq, Syria, and poor little Lebanon, which is about to become a failed state. So, these questions are huge. And how do you deal with human rights problems? Iran does have an incentive to negotiate, because while the Biden administration is willing to lift many sanctions on Iran, it will not lift all of them. There are separate sanctions related to whether it's terrorism designations or the missile program and human rights abuses. Those will still be in place. And Iran's future, its revolution, depends on its economic health. Revolutions that have utopian ideologies and promise to improve the condition of the oppressed, as the Iranians say, have a real challenge in delivering. And 40 years in, the original revolutionaries are dying out. The supreme leader is now in his early 80s. And he knows that the stakes are huge in Iran. And that's why this recent election that you alluded to is so important. It's laying the groundwork for arguably one of the most important transitions since the 1979 revolution. And it was not free and fair. There were almost 600 people registered to run, including 40 women, and all but 7 were disqualified. 3 of them then dropped out, so it was a field of 4. 3 of them hardliners and 1 kind of centrist. And a hardliner won, the chief of the judiciary, who is associated with one of the greatest periods of executions in the late 1980s since the revolution. And so it's going to be very hard for the Biden administration to engage in the eyes of public opinion, in the eyes of divided Washington, with a regime that is led by such a man with such atrocious credentials.
So how do we really deal with this if we really want to deal with China and to some extent Russia as our key issues? Can you really deal with those given the relations with Iran without confronting Iran, either trying to do so positively or negatively?
The United States clearly.
Can you avoid Iran?
No, you can't. And that's the key. That every administration that has tried to pivot to Asia this century has been sucked back into the Middle East. And the problems in many ways are deepening. Iraq is, the ISIS caliphate has disappeared, but the US is also winding down its military presence. And there are questions about whether Iraq is strong enough politically or militarily to deal with its many problems, including the division between Sunni and Shiite that led to the rise of ISIS. Syria, we've ceded to the Russians. This is a region in terrible crisis, but Iran is the biggest one of all. And you're right, we can't pivot to China. We can't get there until we solve this basic issue of Iran. And as I said, it's no longer just the nuclear issue. That's one we have a possibility, still problematic, but a possibility of finding resolution, hopefully within the next month. But then it gets harder. And I think Joe Biden is going to face some really tough questions when it comes to Iran.
I'd like to talk a little bit about Afghanistan, because I know you've recently been there, you've written about it. And when I think about Afghanistan, all of us, I think of 9/11, but which is how we came in the first place. But, I live in Los Angeles, and Hollywood is very prominent. And I remember as if it was yesterday, before 9/11, there were all these movements about saving women in Afghanistan because women were suffering so greatly. What happens now that we're leaving and the Taliban don't look like they've changed their views on women, and they don't look like they're going to lose? where do we go? What happens to America vis-a-vis Afghanistan after all these years of involvement? And if we go back to the same problems we had before, as I say, before 9/11, what do we do about that? How does Afghanistan look? What will it be like? I mean, in Vietnam, we got away with it. I mean, it's not a democratic government and a country, but Vietnam was able to emerge as a fairly stable country. We can say that, but Afghanistan is so different.
It is indeed. And I actually spent a lot of time in Vietnam, and I was the pool reporter on Air Force One with President Clinton when he became the first president to go to Vietnam after the war. It was a very moving experience. I was in Afghanistan during the Taliban's rule. That was my first trip. I drove from Peshawar across the Khyber Pass into Taliban territory and Kabul. And, you know, seeing women in burqas is really a profoundly troubling experience because of everything it symbolized, the isolation of women, even when they were outside. So I think the tragedy in the eyes of American historians will be that we walked away from a country where we saw such progress for women in education, in politics, in the economy, in society. You know, they have a program that's the equivalent of American Idol. And, you know, women competed, you know, sang in public, inspiring places in culture. And I think the danger is that the Taliban will probably take over large parts of the country, possibly not all of it, because of sectarian differences. I mean, ethnic differences more than sectarian, but both, that there will be parts of the country that stand up to the Taliban. It'll be kind of a replication of the period after the Soviets withdrew and before the Taliban took over, when there was just utter chaos and civil war raged. Most of Kabul was destroyed during that civil war, not by the Soviets, but by the war among Afghans themselves. And my fear is the status of women. I care about that as a woman, but I also care about all the people the United States convinced to help it. The interpreters, the people who have worked for American companies, contractors, the American consulates, beefed up the diplomats. All of these people will be, and their families will be deeply vulnerable. And the United States has pledged to evacuate many of the, we don't know what percentage, but thousands of those who had been interpreters. But what about all the people they left behind, the families, the children? All of them will be vulnerable. And it is an atrocity, really. There were never any good solutions in Afghanistan. We blew it over and over and over in terms of our tactics. I suspect that we will see the last American troops, or the commander anyway, fly out within a week, long before 9/11. I think they're reportedly going to be 650 left behind to help protect the embassy and to short-term help ensure that the airport is open, because without the airport open, there's no ability to get in humanitarian aid. The embassies are unlikely to stay because there'll be no guarantee of an exit route if there is a problem. But I think that the two US interventions of the 21st century in Afghanistan and Iraq are two of the greatest mistakes militarily, what we did in American history. And it's such a tragedy.
It's too bad that Afghanistan can't be split into two countries, but that hasn't worked. And of course, I assume the Taliban would just move right into the other country. But you just mentioned Iraq, and that leads me to my next question. In your experiences in the region, and that is ISIS, which the previous administration, the Trump administration, believed it had solved, but it doesn't look. It's more and more not looking that way. what do you see happening, and what do you see as the American role as we go forward if this gets worse? I suspect that one of the reasons the head of Iraq was so critical a few days ago about the American role a few days earlier in trying to control those opposed to the United States in Iraq was because he's got these pressures from Iran, but also worried about ISIS. I may be wrong, but ISIS, where is it?
So I was on the front line in Mosul as ISIS collapsed in Iraq in 2017, and in March last year, 2019, I was on the front line in Syria as our US-backed militia, the Syrian Democratic Forces, were fighting to liberate Baghouz, the last stronghold of ISIS. So I saw it as the 2 points that were its major defeats. And it's striking that the US now estimates there are anywhere from 10, 12 to 18,000 ISIS fighters still in parts of Iraq and Syria, that it is capable still of getting out its word, not capable of recruiting a lot of foreign fighters to enter. Turkey has cracked down. It's harder to get into Syria, difficult to get into Iraq. There's not a physical territory to get in, to kind of join, but it is capable of carrying out assassinations, kidnappings, suicide bombings, particularly in Iraq, and but also in Syria. And so, this is an ongoing problem. The extremism in its many forms still is vibrant as a political force, as a militia, in part because there are so many autocracies or failed states in the region. People feel their governments have not delivered, whether it's a stability or economic opportunity, an end to corruption. There are so many flashpoints that extremists of different kinds, whether it's the franchises of Al-Qaeda or ISIS and some of the others, have grown. It's hard for me to believe that ISIS is as far away as Mozambique in Southern Africa. I was in Mozambique for its independence in June 1975, and this was a country that was a Portuguese colony. The idea that ISIS could take territory in Mozambique is just unbelievable. It has, it's strong in West Africa. It has franchises in Southeast Asia. Its grasp or its ability to operate is now fragmented. It doesn't have a caliphate, but it is still a vibrant alternative. And I think it will be in many places until you see some kind of stability. And that gets back to your question about Iraq. This is a country that is deeply divided. It has still not addressed, in almost 2 decades since the US intervention, the basic question of how do you share power among Kurds, Shiites, and Sunnis? How do you share oil revenues equitably among all three? And with those questions still lingering, there is deep resentment among the Sunni community against the Shiite-dominated government. The Kurds voted a couple of years ago in a referendum to become independent. It didn't happen, not likely to anytime soon, but it showed the depth of the challenges to the unity of a state that was only created about 100 years ago. So Iraq faces an enormous number of challenges, ISIS being only one of them.
You mentioned Syria, so I think we should get in there. And then there's Lebanon, but so Syria and Lebanon. In Syria, you talked about our 2 big mistakes since 9/11. Did we make a mistake? Did President Obama make a mistake by being so out of Syria? And how does Lebanon get back to being Lebanon?
Those are 2 different questions. So I was in both Syria and Lebanon
I slipped them in.
and Syria was always kind of a Russian proxy. It has been for the 50 years of the Assad dynasty, Father Hafez and his son Bashar. And since the Civil War, Russia has deepened its engagement, involvement, and hold on Syria. It now has a naval base. The first one it's had on the Mediterranean in Syrian territory. It has an Air Force base. The first one it's had in the Middle East. And that's not going to change. Could the US have done anything differently early? I think President Obama will be faulted historically for imposing a red line on the issue of chemical weapons and then backing away from opting to go to Congress first, and Congress turned on him and didn't give him the authorization. And so the United States looked weak on Syria. We didn't have a whole lot of military options. I mean, did you want to invade another country? The American mood was by 2011 not to get involved in any more Middle East wars. It was not a war that we could have won. We did help the Kurds, and we still have a small presence there. I was back on the front line where I was 2 years ago in March, in the very same place, the Green Village, which is very close to Baghouz. It was the place that was hit this week in retaliation for the U.S. strike on the Iraqi pro-Iranian militias in Iraq and in Syria. And, you know, it's a very small presence, about 900 American troops. They're there technically to be a symbolic military presence to ensure that ISIS doesn't take that territory again. This is a part of Syria where the bulk of its oil resources are. And that's important for the militia we support, the Syrian Democratic Forces, as a revenue source and to keep it out of the hands of Bashar Assad. If we leave, the US-backed militia is unlikely to be able to hold that territory, or at least most of it, indefinitely. The US has a very important kind of symbolic presence. Nobody wants to kind of push the American button and endanger airstrikes and so forth. But again, as we pull down our forces across the region, I suspect that number will probably decrease a little bit. There are not a whole lot of great options for the United States at this point, either in Iraq or Syria. We only have about 2,500 in Iraq, and we may pull some of those out. We're pulling some of the military equipment even out of places like Saudi Arabia. So our footprint in the region is lower across the board. And this in turn is going to affect our ability, since it's close to Afghanistan, to be able to respond quickly if there is some kind of attack on the American embassy in Kabul. So all of this is woven together in one big picture that's not very pretty at the moment.
And Lebanon is a country that had made it and is in terrible shape now. Is there any hope?
So this is what's heartbreaking. I first went to Lebanon in 1975, lived there for 5 years during the Civil War, the Israeli invasion, the rise of Hezbollah, and so forth. And I was again back in March. And this is a country where I think it's 90% of the value of the currency has kind of evaporated, that we've seen many kind of natural crises, with the explosion at the port that was so devastating to huge chunks of Beirut, just destroyed it. Then you have the political crisis. There hasn't been a government since last fall. The warlords who fought the Civil War for 15 years are still fighting that war, only they're doing it politically. And they're not thinking of the bigger good of the Lebanese people. And so Lebanon is today a failing state. And the tragedy is that it was once the Switzerland of the region, where everybody was free to practice their religion, and where they shared power, and where there was a semblance of democracy before any place else. And it just breaks your heart to see the physical and political destruction of this country that was the bridge between East and West.
We've been on a depressive roll of failure and worry, where I think Americans are. We want to solve other problems like ourselves, China, etc. But I would be heavily criticized if I didn't mention the word Israelis and Arabs and Palestinians. And what I think fits, and we could talk about that for several hours, but what I think fits is this whole new relationship with some of the Arab states and Israel. And is this any measure of hope that actually there seems to be more talk about Israeli, not only because of the change of presidents in the United States, but also that the very fact that Israel is talking to some of these states openly and everybody knows quietly others. Is this a little moment of kind of more positive, or is it just a fake, as some of my colleagues believe? And doesn't Iran bring the Israelis and at least some of the Arabs closer together? So this is two parts again, but it's all related to, is there any hope anywhere?
Well, I think it's a good question. And I think the balance of power, the kind of natural alliances in the region are certainly shifting. That we've all known for a long time that Israel had quiet dialogues, whether it was with Morocco or the United Arab Emirates, that there is, because the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and the Arabs and the Israelis all look, or most of them look at Iran as the kind of regional hegemon, the regional threat. There is a new kind of de facto unity of purpose or united vision of their interests, their regional interests. So I do think that the majority of the members, 23, I think, members of the Arab League, have not recognized Israel yet. And the relationships in the Abraham Accords vary. With the United Arab Emirates, you see something that's really stunned us all, with Israelis going on vacation in Dubai. And I think it's very different when it comes to a place like Sudan. This is not a place that is a natural or easy or commercial ally with Israel. And I think there were some kind of swaps involved in the quid pro quo. If these countries recognized Israel, what was in it for them, what the United States would give them. And so there's a long way to go before you have really warm, fuzzy relationships. When you look at the relations between Israel and Egypt, it's still, all these many years, decades later, still occasionally tense. They deal with each other, but they're not the best of friends. And so I think, we're at the beginning of something that is shifting, absolutely. And that's reason for hope. Anytime that you can have dialogue or formal relations, a channel of communication between countries, that helps. Of course, you have to look at the question, why are they doing that? And is that going to in turn foster greater peace? Or does that set up for future conflict, some kind of Israel-Arab alliance that confronts Iran, which would be a much bigger kind of war than we've seen between Israel and the Palestinians. So it's a hopeful moment. What happens next? Can you build on that in tangible ways? Are others going to join in? Perhaps some gradually. Will it make a lot of difference? It'll make some difference. Will it be enough? Not short term, maybe long term. But, Steve, you more than anyone else appreciates the kind of what communication can do in avoiding tension, sometimes just by talking.
Yes, I certainly believe in that. Thank you. Apropos of what you just said, we're going to be in a very different place, it seems. And you've, I think, made this very clear. In so many of these countries in the region and near the region, in terms of a relationship, we're not the big party coming in. The last three presidents have kind of indicated this. but we're still interested in I think, and I think we agree that China and Russia make it difficult for us to say bye-bye totally. But what can we do? Is there any conception of the American future in the region? And I think one of our problems is that because we've had the relationships we've had and made the mistakes we have, it's harder to say, okay, we're going to be a different kind of person. It's hard in private life, and I think it's hard in international life, even though that's probably a bad analogy. Do you see anything for America that in the Middle East that Americans would accept? And a lot of Americans still are very positive about Israel. Other Americans have others, like the Palestinians or even the Saudis in some cases, that they care about. Where do we go from here, do you think, in all your experiences over all the years? Do you have any thoughts? Some people think that we ought to spend more time, I think of this at UCLA, there's a discussion, learning about the Middle East. Some people think that's not for America in the 21st century. It's an interesting intellectual argument that doesn't get much attention, but is kind of under the surface. What's your thoughts?
I've always believed that understanding another culture, wherever else in the world, is fundamental to the understanding of America's place in the world. And that's the duty of every American, not just those who are policymakers in Washington. So I would encourage your colleagues at UCLA to take the study of the Middle East and other parts of the world seriously too. We as an American people are just grossly ill-informed about the world. I'm often staggered at the level of ignorance. If I were a policymaker, I would say, look, there's one thing you can help to do to stabilize the region, and that's engage in activities that help, whether it's further the development of civil societies that can come up with indigenous and legitimate game plans to challenge authoritarian rule. And I'm not talking about supporting, revolutions. I'm talking about just helping build non-government organizations that can, whether it's provide humanitarian aid, help educate, or help the lower classes, that economically we have an important role. The problem is that when you look at American history, we tend to provide economic aid into countries where we're involved militarily. And that was particularly true in both Iraq and Afghanistan. And being near Hollywood, Steve, you will remember well Charlie Wilson's War, which is one of my favorite movies. And it's about a Texas congressman who mobilized Congress to provide billions to support an effort to challenge Soviet control of Afghanistan. And he mobilized so much money, was such an important congressional lobbyist as a member of Congress, that the campaign became known as Charlie Wilson's War. Well, it worked in terms of the Soviets, after a decade, finally left Afghanistan. So Charlie Wilson went back and said, look, we need to provide $1 million, just $1 million to Afghanistan for education. And he got turned down. And the scene at the end of the movie is so striking because one of his fellow congressmen says, Charlie, we don't give a S, I won't say the word, Charlie, we don't give an S about Pakistan. And Charlie Wilson has to say, Afghanistan. And my fear is that we won't, as a nation, now that we're withdrawing from all these places, do enough to help stabilize, to ensure that women have educational opportunities if they're allowed to be educated. And the Taliban, in its one concession, has said it will allow girls to continue to go to schools. Whether that will turn to be its practice, who knows? But that there are these economic opportunities to create jobs, to employ the young who disillusioned with their governments because they don't have jobs, they can't support, help contribute to families, can't get married because they can't pay for housing, pay, support a wife, join groups like ISIS. And that's, the economic health is critical to our nation and to every nation. And in our relations, we often look at kind of trying to replicate what we are militarily or through military means, and not doing enough to support people who are backers of democracy.
I think this is such an important statement that you just made. As you know, I believe in it very strongly, but it's been best stated just now from anything I've ever heard. And I hope through your work and ours, we can make it more knowledgeable, more people understand it more, because so many Americans think it's all or nothing. Either we're in there and running the place, or, we're making it democracy, et cetera, to go back to 1991, 92, 93, or and et cetera, or we're not there at all. And
That's
you
right.
just stated a new formula that Americans don't understand. We're all or nothing, and this is not the vaccines where you either take them or you don't. So in conclusion, I'm very excited about this conclusion, as you see, and I think we really got somewhere. But is there anything else? I mean, you could speak for hours and hours about your wonderful and not so wonderful at times experiences. But is there anything else that you'd like to close on, as important as I think what you just said is?
Oh, there's so much more to say. I wouldn't know where to begin. When I talk to student groups, I say to them, the most important thing in the 21st century and for their lives is to learn 2 languages, only one of which can be European based. That they need to have those 2 languages to be part of the global era. Globalization is coming, whether you like it or not, whether you approve of it or not. And learning a language helps you cross that threshold of understanding a culture. And whether you are fluent in it or not, you learn its characters, you learn a little bit, you learn how to read some of its stories. You don't see it as the other, and it becomes part of your life too. So, if I had one thing to do over in my life, it would be to learn not just French, but to learn Chinese or Arabic or Japanese or Urdu. The rule of thumb when I became a journalist was we all could speak 50 words in 50 languages. Where's the front line? Who's in charge? How many are dead? But this is a moment where we have the educational opportunities, whether it's through schooling or online, to learn other languages, and for America to be part of the world, for us as the most fortunate country in the world. And I say that as the descendant of one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. We should take advantage of every opportunity we have to be the players we could be in the world, and which we too often simply ignore because it's easier not to.
I think that's so important. And the conversation of the last 7-8 minutes is so important for the future of America. But what I see is that we're moving in a different direction. We think too much that we want to get out of the world, whereas what we're not thinking about is how to get into the world in a different way than we've done since World War II. And that's one of our biggest problems. And we don't even understand it's our problem. And I see that, unfortunately, on the campuses as well. But I hope we can find a way, I have a couple of ideas, of course, that we can promote this theme, which is so often lost on Americans, because getting back to the beginning of the state, we thought we were different from everybody else. And, you know, in the era of Zoom that we're on, it's a different world, and you can't be different from everybody else without being part of everybody else, as we see that lots of countries have not solved their problem with this very dangerous illness. We won't ultimately be able to solve it either. And I think that's just the epitome of the fact that you can't escape the world. One of the problems that the last administration, of course, had to confront. Anyway, thank you so much. I hope we can do it again. I have a couple of ideas and I'll be in touch. And thank all of you for this exciting discussion. And we look forward to our programs. I should look at my preparation notes and say we have several programs that are moving along. And if you are interested in learning more, sign up for our mailing list shared on the screen right now and in the chat window. Thank you so much, Robin Wright, for being with us this today.
Thank you, Steve. It was great fun.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Ciao.
Thank you. For me too.